I'm Maury Gelman. It's Tuesday, July 27, 1999. I'm conducting an interview with John Conte in his home in Malibu, California.
Murray's told everybody that we're in Malibu, so
I'd like to begin at a logical place with your name, if I may. What is it?
John Conte,
No nickname, no middle initial?
none.
You were called John when you were growing up?
Yes,
That's the name that appears on your birth certificate.
that's the way it appears. Right.
Right. Where were you born and when?
In a little town in Massachusetts called Palmer in the year 1915.
Where is Palmer in relation, say, to Boston?
It is between Springfield and Worcester,
Ah,
two recognizable cities. Palmer, it's south of Boston.
did you actually grow up there?
My father moved us all to Southern California when I was 5.
What did your father do to make a living?
He was a baker with his brothers. They had a company in Los Angeles, early Los Angeles, called Three Brothers Baking Company.
So you were 5, so do you remember that trip at all across country?
Yes, I do.
Was it made by motor vehicle?
Motor, right.
And what do you remember about it?
It was a long and very happy experience for me and my 3 sisters and brother. And it was like a great adventure for us. Looking back, it would seem impossible that a family, parents of 5 children, could all make a trip like that in a Dodge touring car with all the paraphernalia we needed, and we camped along the way. There were no motels in those days. And we fortunately were traveling during a period of the year when the weather was mild all the way. And I'll never forget the great thrill when we got close enough to California to see our first palm trees.
Where do you fit in the family group? Were you in the middle? Were you the oldest, the youngest?
I'm my brother, who unfortunately died as a young man of 19, was the eldest, and I had an older sister, Christine, and then I came along, and then I had 2 younger sisters, Grace and Eleanor. Grace and Eleanor and I are the only ones who are existent at this time.
So you came to Southern California, actually to Los Angeles in 1920. What did Los Angeles look like at that time?
Difficult to describe. It was less than a little village almost. There were oil wells pumping in downtown. There were surface trolleys, of course, and Broadway was the main street, flanked by Spring Street and Hill, and there were some very important hotels that were in existence at that time. Now, my father's baking company sold to restaurants and hotels, did not have any retail business.
Where was it located?
It was located at the confluence of North Broadway and where the Los Angeles General Hospital was at that time.
And where was your home?
Our home was in a community called El Sereno, which was adjacent to Alhambra, which made me eligible to go to Lincoln High School when I grew into that period in my life.
Was it a happy childhood?
Very happy.
What made it happy? Just a close-knit family?
Closeness of the family and the relationship I had with not only my parents, but my sisters and my brother until I was 14 when he died, and that was a traumatic moment for all of us.
How did he die?
Tuberculosis. And unfortunately, it was prior to the advent of penicillin. So the only therapy that they had was to move to, I remember a town called Glendora was famous at that time for its sanitarium with that kind of therapy. But my brother went too quickly for that.
Now, this was the early days of radio. Did you grow up listening to radio?
Yes, I did. Grew up listening to radio, and Crosby, Colombo, and Valley were the three big names at that time.
In terms of singers. Terms of singers.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, and drama was very important to us. And strangely enough, the bigger stations in Los Angeles were not terribly interested in drama. The Warner Brothers station was the leader, KFWB, which today is, is all news. But it was the leader in drama, and it had a very loyal and large audience for it.
But the major station was KFI, which did a lot with music because John, help me out, the owner of the station was very much into classical music.
Oh, yes. Who was that? Smith?
No.
KFAC at that time, or KFWB? What are you talking about?
KFI.
KFI, Earl C. Anthony.
Earl C. Anthony.
Right. Right.
So you remember listening to that station? And
Yes. Matter of fact, when I started my career in earnest, I was on KFI, part of the NBC network.
It was the NBC flagship station on the West Coast.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Well, clear channel, and it was 50,000 watts, and it was heard all over the Northern Hemisphere.
So did radio have a great impact on you? I mean, did you start daydreaming about being on radio yourself?
I really did not. It was a combination of several things. I had the good fortune in high school to have a drama instructor who took an interest in me and who was an advocate of Shakespeare. And we did a Shakespeare production every semester. And my fellow Lincolnians, to drop a couple of names, they preceded me by a few years. John Huston, famous director. Robert Young went on to a marvelous career. Robert Preston, whom I was influential in helping, because after graduation, I went to work at the Pasadena Playhouse while searching for employment. And it was one of my high school mates, a wonderful character actor named Lou Merrill, who called me one day and he said, "Would you be interested in doing an acting job on radio?" And I said, "Of course." So he said, "Well, come on out here and audition for this producer who's looking for a young man to play this role." So I went to this radio station, KFAC, AC standing for Auburn Cord. It was owned by Mr. E.L. Cord, who invented the Cord automobile and the Auburn. And I auditioned for this producer, and he said, "You've got the job." And that was my first acting job on radio.
Had you not taken any kind of dramatic lessons, or singing lessons, any of that?
Yes, I had singing from the time I was 16 with my private tutor.
Why did you get into singing?
I was in the
motivated
choir
you?
at high school, and the principal's sister was the instructor and the leader of the choir, and she took an interest in me. The principal, who went on to great notoriety, was a lovely lady named Ethel Percy Andrus, Andrus. She later became the catalyst for the movement to aid teachers. There was before unions for teachers, and they were an overlooked minority at the time. And there is an Ethel Percy Andrus School at USC now, which is very famous for the study of
Geriatrics.
Geriatrics, right. So I had my singing going for me, and I had continued my acting at the Pasadena Playhouse, where I did about 3 productions.
No, how did you get to the Pasadena Playhouse? How did that come about?
Well, I lived close to it, my home, and I had admired what they were doing, and I had met a wonderful man who was adapting a play for production at the Playhouse. The book was The Brothers Karamazov, which was a huge job. I'm trying to remember his name, and I hope it'll come to me. But I made myself available to him as a gopher. And he would work all day long writing in longhand the adaptation of the book into the play. And I had told him that my sister, Christine, was a crackerjack typist. And I said, I know she'd be happy to volunteer her services. So the end of every day, I would take his output for the day home with me, and my sister would stay up late typing all of this, and I would take the finished product back to him the next day. Anyway, as a result of that relationship, I was cast in a role in The Brothers Karamazov, and I met the entire Pasadena Playhouse group.
Who were some of those people?
Well, a man named Gilmore was the head who actually owned the Playhouse. And I can't remember many of the names of the people who were involved, but they had, a complete theatrical teaching company there. They had dance and music and drama and comedy and the whole works. So I had a little bit of that.
By this time, did you have any inkling that you might have some talent for this kind of thing?
Well, I always believed in myself, and it was a desire for me to work in that area. So
at a fairly early age, you decided to go on with a entertainment kind of career?
Exactly. I graduated at 16, and I went to work immediately at the Playhouse. And
getting paid for your work?
No.
No?
No. And after The Brothers Karamazov, I was in the production of an old Heidelberg where I got to sing, and one other I can't recall at the time. But it was during that period that Bob Preston, whose name was Preston Meservey, who called me because he was in the class right behind me. And he said, "Can you get me into the Playhouse?" And I said, "Of course." Gilmore Brown was the head of the Playhouse. So I told Gilmore Brown about my friend, and he said, "Bring him in." I did. And that was the beginning of Bob Preston's career. He changed his name from Meservey to Preston. So then after my involvement with those productions, my friend Lou Merrill called me and got me started in the radio aspect of things. Now, I did this role on this series, a drama series called Doctors Courageous.
A series that was being produced on the West Coast.
It was local.
Local.
Just local on KFAC. And it was a series dramatizing the great doctors who became famous for stellar contributions to medicine. And after I worked there for about...
Excuse me, what was your role? I mean, did you play a part in these, or were you an announcer?
Each was complete. Each was a complete story, And when it was produced, it was set aside, and a new doctor was dramatized for whatever he did.
So you were playing one of the characters
Yeah.
in the play? And describe what it was like to do a radio play in those days. What would the studio look like?
Well, the studio was a conventional radio studio, but I'm not talking about contemporary studios because they've disintegrated, I understand, to DJ type operations. But it was a fairly large room, I would say 20 feet by 30 feet, and an area for an orchestra and a grand piano and microphones all over the place.
Was it
And
soundproofed?
yeah. This studio was on the penthouse of the E.L. Cord building on Wilshire Boulevard, which is right across the street from the Ambassador Hotel. And the ground floor was his showroom for his automobiles. And I would go to work every day and walk through that showroom and salivate at these beautiful automobiles, the Auburn boat tail roadster and the Cord with all of its magnificent lines and characteristics.
So essentially, the radio station was to help promote his automobile products.
Yes and no, because he didn't depend too much on his local radio station, although it did carry some advertising for it. But it's just he was interested in broadcasting. He
So would
wound
you
up.
take a script up to a microphone and just read off the script into the microphone?
That was it. We'd all rehearse on mic with our scripts, and when the time came to go on the air, the red button would go on, and the director would say start, and we'd start.
Weren't you terribly nervous at first?
At first I was, yeah. But then I thought, gee, nobody else is nervous around here. I'm going to act the same way.
And you were getting paid for this now?
We were paid the munificent sum of $10 a performance. Now, I'm talking about 1934. 1934.
When you were then 19, would you have been then?
I was 16 when I graduated in 32, and I was about 18 when I started, yeah.
And so you went on to other radio roles?
Well, most of my radio drama participation was at KFAC. Now, the manager of the station became aware of me, and he said to me on one occasion, look, you're only making $10 a week here. How would you like to go on my staff as an announcer, and I'll pay you $25 a week? And I said, I'll take it. That's where I got started in the announcing end of things.
Were you announcer for very many of the programs then?
Well, in those days, the announcers were assigned a shift on the microphone. And since we were not a network affiliate, all of the programming was local, and most of it was recorded music, some sports, and some drama. And the outshot of that was I was heard locally by a producer at the CBS affiliate in Los Angeles who called me and said, would you like to audition for a position here?
Which station was this?
It was KHJ at that time. And it was the CBS affiliate for many, many years. I naturally reacted positively. I went down and auditioned, which was a trying kind of an experience.
What would an audition be
Well,
like?
they had formal audition material for you to read. It tested your ability to read cold. It tested your ability to pronounce words that may not be familiar in everyday language. And it also tested your composure on how you would act under a little pressure. So they hired me. And I went to work for my first network affiliate.
Now, did they have special announce booths that you
Yeah.
worked out of?
Yes.
What would an announce booth look like?
It was a very small room, no more than 6 feet by 6 feet, I would say. And it consisted primarily of a desk with, excuse me, microphone and some control dials. And there was room on the desk for the copybook to read commercials and for station IDs, and everything was going to happen on the station that day locally, because the network, when they took over, of course, provided all the programming.
Would you have to sit there for 8 hours or
Well,
lengthy periods of time?
You'd get some breaks, yeah, and in a half-hour show that was on, you were free to get up and stretch your legs, but not wander too far, because if you ever missed a break, that was a serious offense.
You were not the only announcer for the
Oh,
station.
no. They had a full staff there of about 6 announcers. And they originated quite a bit of programming, including, in those days, the network affiliates in radio all had orchestras. And they were full orchestra, about 30 men. And they would produce musical programs. Raymond Page was the orchestra leader there. He later went on to fame as the orchestra leader at the Radio City Music Hall. And then I worked extensively with a wonderful conductor and musician named David Brookman. And he became quite noted for his musical contributions. He's a composer as well as a conductor. And it was very exciting. At that time, CBS decided to buy its own radio station in Hollywood, which would serve the LA market. So they bought a station called KNX, which they own to this day. Now that was pretty traumatic for Don Lee, who owned KHJ. Don Lee, at that time, was the Cadillac dealer for California, virtually, because he owned a dealership in San Diego, where he owned a radio station. He owned the dealership in Los Angeles, where he owned a radio station. He owned a dealership in Santa Barbara, where he owned a radio station. And he owned a dealership in San Francisco, where he also owned a radio station. So he created what he called the Don Lee Network.
A regional network.
Original network of all the radio stations. Now, when CBS departed, he scrambled and wound up with a brand new network that had already been formed in the East, but did not have a West Coast operation. It was called the Mutual Broadcasting System. And so we flowed then from CBS into the Mutual Network.
And Mr. Don Lee was the great rival of Earl C. Anthony, the
Right.
owner of KFI.
KFI, and he owned the Packard Automobile Agency. And David Sarnoff, whom I had the good fortune to meet and to know later on in my career, told me later that he had tried for many, many years to buy KFI from Earl C. Anthony, but he said that old man never budged. He would not sell me that station. So NBC wound up without a radio affiliate, or rather O&O, in Los Angeles all those years. But when television came in, of course, they established their own O&O. That was a different story.
Now, as your radio career was emerging, there was an economic depression going on in the country. How did that affect you, your family, your work?
Well, I was still living at home with my parents, and of course, I became the fair-haired boy because it wasn't too long before I was earning as much money as my father. But it was deep depression. It was tough. And the radio business, for me, answered a number of needs, financial, of course, and career-wise, because it opened the doors along the way.
Now, as you were doing your announcing, were you also furthering your singing career?
Yes, all that time I kept on with my voice study. I wasn't able to use it much professionally, but I kept working at it.
You had confidence that you could make something of yourself with your singing voice?
Yes, I did. I did.
Did people encourage you?
My mother always encouraged me. My father he was a little dubious, but he went along with it, and everybody in the family was involved in some musical activity. My sisters all studied the piano. So, it was a nice environment.
So how did your radio career progress from when Don Lee took over? The network.
I found that I was named the chief announcer, which in those days carried a little more money with it and a title and so on. And I wanted to do some movie work. So I got myself an agent. He was a very, very nice fellow who was part of the William Morris Agency, which was a long-established firm. And he started getting me jobs in films as a radio announcer. The first one was as a racetrack caller of a very dramatic race.
In what movie was that?
Beg pardon?
What movie was that?
It was called The Crowd Roars. How did I remember that?
It's a well-known picture, actually.
Oh, yes. And I can't remember the name of the second film, but it got me my Screen Actors Guild card. And then with my continuing work on KHJ, I had a call from a wonderful man named George Burns. He was looking for an announcer for his radio show with Gracie Allen.
We'll have to pick that up after we change our tape.